Good morning, folks. If you can begin taking a seat so we can begin our programming this morning, that would be lovely. Thank you. I do love the holy chatter. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful sound. Holy chatter, yes. Well, good morning again, beloved of God. My name is Lisette Acosta, and I am the director of Brite's Center for Lifelong Learning, which is a department that oversees this little production. Once again, welcome to Ministry Week 2026. It is my hope, indeed my prayer, that somewhere between the conversations, the holy chatter, the learning, the worship, and the laughter, you will be encouraged. May you leave this week with hearts full, and may your cup run over. Before I hand the mic to the person who will be introducing our speaker this morning, I need to make just a few announcements to help you make the most of your time with us. The first thing is on the second floor, there's a lot of things happening on the second floor, so please take the time and get up there. You'll find our nonprofits, our vendors, and these are local nonprofit organizations who are incarnating God's love in beautifully creative and faithful ways. So please stop by their tables and be inspired by the work that they are doing and the way that they are seeking to embody God's love in their communities. Also happening on the second floor, if you go up the stairs that are just right out these doors, and then you go to the right, you will find the Ministry Week bookstore. And there we are featuring books that are written by Brite faculty and by all of our speakers. Not every title by all our speakers is there, but we do have the titles that they've selected. And so make your way up the stairs and check out the Ministry Week bookstore. Consider this your theological nourishment you can take home with you. Because art is one of the many ways in which we express our connection to the divine, we have this time, for the first time, a Ministry Week art gallery. And so if you go again upstairs, and this time you're going to veer to the left to make a quick right around the corner, you will find a small but powerful art exhibit featuring 4 local artists. The artists themselves will be present during our break times, and so please make your way there and take the time to linger, to look at their artwork, and perhaps to listen to their artist and to their art. And also happening on the second floor, for those of you who registered for a boxed lunch, please bring your registration sheet to the second floor to pick up your lunch. Tables have been set up in room 207, but there are plenty of spaces around the church where you can have your lunch and share the meal with someone and hopefully take the time to catch up with an old friend. And now it is my pleasure to invite Assistant Dean Chai Motupali to come forward and to present our guest this morning. Thank you, Chai.
Good morning. So my name is Chaitanya Motupali, and as Lizette said, you can call me Chai. And I serve as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Brite Divinity School. It is my joy to welcome you all to this session of Ministry Week as we gather under this year's theme, Incarnating Love, the sacred work of loving others. To speak of love as incarnating is to insist that love is not merely confessed, but practiced, risked, and embodied. That is, it takes flesh in particular places, among particular people, and in the midst of a complex and often broken world. To insist that love can be incarnated is to attend carefully to where love is needed, where justice is deferred, and how faith is formed in the midst of such realities. It is within this theological horizon that this morning's lecture, Incarnating Justice for Such a Time as This, finds its significance. I'm deeply honored to welcome our speaker this morning, Reverend Dr. Christine Hong, Associate Professor of Educational Ministry at Columbia Theological Seminary, where she also serves as lead professor for the Doctor of Educational Ministry program. Dr. Hong's scholarship and teaching engage decolonial and anti-colonial approaches to religious education, with particular attention to Asian diasporic communities, intercultural formation, and the ways theology is shaped by lived experience, power, and history. She's the author of several influential works, including Youth, Identity, and Gender in the Korean American Church, and Decolonial Futures, Intercultural and Interreligious Intelligence for Theological Education. Across her writing and teaching, Dr. Hong helps faith communities discern how justice is not merely proclaimed, but practiced, how it is learned, embodied, and sustained through communities committed to love that is honest, costly, and transformative. So we are so grateful for her presence with us this morning and for the wisdom she brings to this shared work of theological reflection and faithful practice. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Christine Hong.
Before I begin today, I would like to thank Brite Divinity School and Dr. Lizette Acosta for the invitation to give the Scott Lecture this morning. I would also like to thank all of you who've come from near and far in uneasy and painful times to listen to one another's stories and to learn from one another about what it takes to move the world forward in times like these. You can move to the next slide. Today, I want to introduce three concepts. The first is incarnation as rebirth energy. The second is incarnation as the remembrance of real stories and histories, including our interconnected histories. And the third is how to incarnate justice through the transmutation of energies for such a time as this. Next slide, please. Incarnation feels and sounds centrally Christian to many of us because of how we've heard it taught and preached so many times in the classroom and from pulpits like this. We've heard it proclaimed as the incarnation, as if there can only be one, as if incarnation only occurs for Christians, as if it only occurs one way. However, the idea of incarnation and even reincarnation is not new to the world, and it was not introduced to us through Christianity alone. Incarnation and reincarnation are part of different religious traditions beyond Christianity, including Buddhism, Hinduism, and even the tradition that I practice alongside my Christian faith, Mugyo. Next slide, please. Mugyo is a Korean indigenous tradition which can trace its origins to Mongolian animism 5,000 years ago, a tradition still practiced and alive today both on the peninsula and the diaspora. Korean Mugyo teaches us that we are each born full of individual energy and collective energy into a time and place for a purpose to contribute to the moment, to one another, and to the collective. Again, there's no such thing as individual energy, really. It's a collective source energy into which we all belong and into which we all participate. How we choose to belong and participate is completely different. And indeed, there are consequences to the choices we make of how to interpret and harness the energy that moves in and through us. Consequences that ripple beyond this time and place and beyond this one lifetime. For instance, I often share with my students that when I think about my human relationships, whether they're with my family or my friendships, I'm careful in my practice because I know that the type of relationships I cultivate with people in this lifetime will echo into other lifetimes. A harsh word from me to my child in this lifetime might echo into the next, or it might be an echo from another, wounding us both into other lifetimes, or tugging at a wound carried on our backs into this life from another. A friend and a colleague of mine who is a Korean wudang or shaman, she often reminds me of a Korean shamanic saying. We say this: if you choose a partner in this life, like if you marry this person, it's possible that they were your mortal enemy in a previous life. When I asked her to explain this to me, she said, well, basically, if you couldn't work out your problems with one another back then, the universe is going to force you to face them now, in different bodies, but work on them you will nonetheless. I think it's pretty harsh. But her teaching parallels another Korean concept called Chung, which is a word about relationships that is rooted in spirit and culture. Next slide, please. Chung undergirds our relationships with one another, and it's a feeling of mutuality that's deeper than love. You can have Chung with people that you love deeply and with those with whom you have enmity. Chung is about being tethered together, affection and feeling that continues to pull people's spirits together despite distance, time past, or experiences. Chung is a form of incarnational and communal energy that is developed between spirits. Not only is energy always collective, Mugya also believes that there's no such thing as accidental energy. It doesn't just appear out of thin air. Energy is always returning to us like Chung from somewhere else, from someone else. There's no such thing as energy destroyed or dissipated or disappeared. All energy travels and moves with purpose across generations and across space and time. Next slide, please. If we try and understand this decolonially, we also believe that energy is landed with a capital L. Claudio Cavallis talks about this idea of landedness as a decolonial concept. Cavallis reminds us that through the violence of colonialism, our people lose their landedness or their attachment with the land. He says, quote, with the loss of this connection, this fundamental link, we create a way of cultivating ourselves that will always be suspended from the earth, end quote. According to Cavallis, the suspension and separation away from land calls to a colonized people that nurtured our ancestors and that they nurtured in return. And this is a deep trauma that we are continually attempting to mend. We are constantly drawn to stories of land and on the land, and land is in turn constantly trying to draw its people to it and trying to draw its stories to it. We are magnets, minerals, truly. Our energy and life force is in many ways the same. The land remembers us, and our bodies and our spirits remember the land. There is deep Chung between us. Energy, whether it travels through us or out of us or through us and out of land, and time is always moving. And often it's us, humans, and more than humans, and other beings with whom we share this planet who propel the energy forward and backward. In other words, you might say, we all incarnate and reincarnate. Next slide. Therefore, stay with me here, What if God, the divine, the creator, also incarnated into human form as a practice of what God had already created us and every part of creation to do? What God did when God incarnated into human form at a specific place and time, the transmutation and transformation of energy, the movement of divine energy shifted with intentionality into human form, compressed into flesh, bone, and blood, created and formed in the womb of a young woman, and then painfully birthed through human effort, her human effort alone, into dirt and straw under the earthly night sky. What if it was done with depth and purpose? What if God learned as God grew into a boy under the watchful gaze of his mother, in the embrace of a human family? What if it was with purpose? What God did and said with that human form while among humankind and among the more than humankind, all of it was purposeful. The energy produced by God here on earth during those 33 years, what if it remains with us, moving through us? God's energy, that Jesus energy of miraculous events, the feeding, healing, casting out of illness, demons, whatever you believe demons to be, the naming of injustice in the community, in systems and structures of government, of violence, the naming of violence in words, silence, and acts of things left undone, the energy of seeing people as they are, touching them, honoring them when no one else would do so, the calling out of a small child's faith, a shared lunch of 7 loaves and a few fishes offered up when no one else would offer up their meal. What if it is all still here with us, incarnated, energy still moving? It is all still here, propelling us forward and backward still. The love Jesus shared with students whom he turned into friends over the years, the meals he shared with neighbors, with family, with his mother, who told him to come home because it's getting late, with his father, with his siblings, the tears he shed, the fear he felt, the hope he possessed in humanity, all that energy that lived and moved in him still pulses through the world, through the universe. It is still here with us, incarnated once and for all, and it reincarnates again and again because energy is never destroyed. It pulses onward. It revisits with us. When we read the stories, we tell them in our own voices, in our own words, in our mother tongues and languages. It is here. God is here with us. And it changes how we think of Emmanuel, doesn't it? Whether incarnation or reincarnation, the idea that energy does not disappear but continues on is shared among different people of different traditions, including both of mine. But how you use that energy, how you leave it in the world when your body separates from your spirit, how you send that energy each and every day, how you incarnate and reincarnate that Jesus energy is up to you. How will you contribute to the collective source energy? What will you take from it, and how will you transform it by being here? How does who you are and what you do and what you leave undone ripple into the universe and into the future? And how might it also ripple into the past? Next slide, please. Not all people, cultures, and wisdoms understand time as linear. For many of our people, time, when understood decolonially, the past and the future are here with us all together in the present moment. As we watch fascism and authoritarianism manifest itself so easily on the streets of this country, in cities and suburbs everywhere, many people, including some of us perhaps here, are surprised. We're surprised to see a democratic nation's Constitution and Bill of Rights so easily ignored by those in power, corrupted and dismantled. In the days around the murder of 2 white people, Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy, I've heard many among us say, "This isn't the United States of America I know. This isn't the America I love." And to them I say, this energy didn't incarnate in 2024. It didn't incarnate in 2016 either. So when people mourn saying this isn't the country I love, the country I remember, next slide please, whose country are you referring to? Whose stories are you remembering and retelling? Whose memories are you invoking? And in doing so, whose lives, bodies, and voices have you erased? How are you using the energy that moves through you? Many of us know. Many of our ancestors on this land and the land itself and across different oceans know that this is indeed the United States of America, and it has always been. Too many of our neighbors are suddenly surprised to experience a government that won't play by the rules and instead makes up the rules convenient only to itself and the billionaires with power. How could a democracy crumble so fast? I've heard people wondering as they watch the fascist feds pile on top of the elderly, knees on necks, all from the comforts of their apps as they sip their watered-down $8 matcha lattes. How could they kill Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy in broad daylight while they have yet to hear the names of Keith Porter Jr., Luis Gustavo Nunes Cáceres, Geraldo Lunas Campos, Victor Manuel Diaz, Paradila, Luis Beltran Yanes Cruz, Hibar Sanchez Domingos. I don't mention this to shame people who are just learning and opening their eyes to what the United States of America has always been since before its official founding. I ask these questions because part of moving the collective energy forward and transforming it means we have to know and understand how we've misused the energy before. In order to transform and transmute what we are experiencing, we have to relearn and understand what we've never learned to see. Next slide, please. This energy, the intent to murder, to kill, to dispose, to dispossess, to steal, to conquer, to master, this mindset and intention didn't just appear out of thin air. It traveled here. It followed a designated path, and it arrived where it intended. This democracy was paid for by entire peoples, taken, stolen, genocided, by entire lands, flat-top mountains, resources pillaged here and in other lands, by children mining for minerals even now. This energy traveled here from somewhere, from folks, from lives, from calculated intentions, from histories erased, rewritten, propped up, and force-fed to generations at a time until it met us here today. It traveled through the lives of people we know and the people we don't know, through Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and Philando Castile, through Native Hawaiians and Alaskans and enslaved Black Americans and children in residential schools, too many lives and loved ones to name today. That energy of malicious intent to steal breath and to take lives, to dismember communities and families arrived with purpose until it got to us today, to now. You see, incarnation and reincarnation are not haphazard and accidental occurrences, and incarnation is not always good. Part of how we understand incarnation and how we transmute the energy is to remember and remember how the energies got here, how we got here. Next slide, please. What we are experiencing today is called the imperial boomerang. The concept of the imperial boomerang comes from the work of Aimé Césaire in his 1950 text called The Discourse on Colonialism. He originally called this concept the terrific boomerang, and he used this concept to explain the origins of European fascism in the first half of the 20th century. In his book, Césaire describes the boomerang in this way, quote, "One fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, and people are surprised. They become indignant. They say, 'How strange,' but never mind, it'll pass. And they wait and they hope and they hide the truth from themselves. That is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms. that it's Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had only been applied to non-European peoples, that they've cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it. Another way to think more broadly about the imperial boomerang is the casting out and away of historically dominating and conquering acts of power from the seat of the imperial core to the lands and people across the world, which through acts of violence changes landscapes, extracts resources, erases histories, languages, steals generations of people for labor, seats tyrants and dictators over people, and buttresses up authoritarianism under a thin facade of democracy, all to purchase life and liberty for some, and the pursuit of the newest iPhone and the best electric car battery. The imperial boomerang is cast out far and wide across the globe, but the boomerang always returns. What the imperial core throws out eventually comes back to its source with just as much force. To understand the imperial boomerang is to understand what people who do not live in the imperial core or who have been subjects and subjugated to the imperial core have always understood. Violent energy incarnates more violence. Yet sometimes as we sit in the core of the imperial core, even with Cesar's helpful and disturbing image as an explanation of colonial violence, we still struggle to understand how our historical choices as people are affecting us today. We still don't know, understand, or tell our stories, at least the true stories. Instead, those of us in powerful places tell one another stories of convenient comfort, convenient hope, and convenient love. These stories are actually stories that distract us from the necessary discomfort of truth. For instance, here in the United States, we look too far and away for the imperial boomerangs because we don't want to recall the boomerangs that are returning to us from just around the corner. The boomerangs that are coming back to us more quickly from shorter distances. Energies that are reincarnating more quickly because the violence occurred on this land, and this land remembers. We want to point to over there when we first need to attend to right here and now. We have to ask ourselves about the convenience of pointing to events far away when those events are actually deeply connected to the events right here. In response to the authoritarianism in cities like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Portland, and others, many people are looking to World War II and the founding and perpetuation of Nazism, which is indeed history that we must not forget, information that we have to remember accurately. However, we must also take a look at what happened here that also inspired the fascism of Hitler's Third Reich. His ideology and practice of dehumanization was born in the United States of America. How the United States of America practiced dehumanization on Turtle Island and across the globe. The inspiration for the death camps were the concentration camps in the Philippines and the extermination of Filipinos 10 and older during the Philippine-American War of 1899 through 1902. It was a scorched earth policy. It was the deeply white supremacist ideology of westward expansion, anti-indigeneity, and anti-black foundation of this nation, its inhuman system and history of chattel enslavement with the psychological and religious framings that supported those ideologies that enthralled Hitler and inspired his fascist ideals. Models for the Gestapo were the human traffickers, the slave catchers of the South, who were then reformed into the modern-day police force we have today. Which is why when politicians call for ICE reform, we respond with calls for abolition because this nation has tried police and judicial reform before. Yes, it has. And the Brennan Center for Justice and the ACLU and Prison Policy Initiative all tell us that these police, judicial, and prison reforms have still gotten the United States of America 20 to 25% of the world's incarcerated population, with the United States having only 5% of the world's entire population. Which means 1 in 4 incarcerated persons in the world live here, the land of the free. Not to mention, 37 to 38% of the incarcerated people are black, while black people are only 13% of the population. 23% of incarcerated people are Latinx, while only 16% of the population are Latinx. Native populations are also incarcerated at higher rates than are represented in populations. Those numbers are difficult to track because the federal government has done an incredible job perpetuating the slow and intentional genocide of Native peoples on their own land, Turtle Island, with justice and liberty for all. When we think of the imperial boomerang, we want to ignore the boomerang that travels across this nation, coming back towards us more quickly. Instead, to avoid having to relearn and learn real histories, we look out towards boomerangs thrown overseas. We want to recall Anne Frank when we might first recall the Underground Railroad that stretched through Mexico and Canada. You see, perhaps we've not actually felt the boomerang of the overseas American imperialism in its totality just yet. Maybe that's still coming for us. Perhaps we've not yet felt the boomerang of the United States as both the visible and invisible hand of militarism as the world's cop. The boomerang of the Philippines, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Libya, Syria, and Gaza. Maybe, just maybe, this moment is the boomerang from the stories that our families lived and still have trouble talking about. The stories represented by the generations who still sit around our tables today, the genocide on these shores, of the cutting of generations and stealing and killing of black and indigenous bodies, of Jim Crow and black codes, of entire forests, orchards, and crops grown from blood-soaked soil. What have we incarnated energetically that we haven't owned up to, named, or paid attention to? What energy is still here with us that we still need to attend to, untangle, and transmute, and send back out changed? In the Korean indigenous tradition of Mugyo, we believe that when ghosts, when ancestors suddenly wake up, ready to tell their stories, we can't ignore them. The living must attend. Next slide, please. When ghosts wake up, they do so because they desire to share their stories not only with their descendants, but with their perpetrators, to the entire community. And when that desire wells up in them, everyone must listen and hear them and inhabit their stories to know the fullness of the story, the truth of what happened. And yes, to repent, to metabolize the pain in order to transmute the energy into healing and ultimately a better life for everyone, for every being. Next slide, please. Storytelling is an act of co-creating justice, telling stories that were unheard and even silenced on this side of life. If you're the type of person who doesn't pay attention to storytelling as a lived methodology and practice of liberation and resistance, you're in the wrong religious tradition. We follow a rabbi and a teacher who told stories to tell and unveil truth, especially when people didn't want to hear about it. A teacher whose last words to his community was, "Tell my story far and wide." Become storytellers so people might experience freedom. Practitioners of Mugyo believe storytelling must not happen in secret, but it has to occur in community and often in public. Stories are sacred, and when they're told in community, in the public square, that sacred energy is then returned from the spirit world through the vessel and voice of the shaman, back to the people who are bearing witness to the words and stories. And when stories are told this way, they finally belong to the community again. The ghosts, the spirits, their stories, their truths and energies are then reincarnated once again. The word became flesh and dwelt among us. There are two major rituals of shamanism that we celebrate and facilitate for this type of storytelling in the Korean indigenous tradition. Next slide, please. It's called the kut and the hanpuri. The hanpuri often happens as part of the kut. The kut is a ritual that can include anything from exorcism to healing. And honestly, exorcism and healing have very porous boundaries. In the midst of an exorcism, the shaman may well realize the family needs healing. A family will know they need a kut when there's an illness that cannot be explained. A family might have illnesses over different generations. A diagnosis of one thing turns into something else upon a visit to a different specialist, and so on and so forth, where illnesses might jump from one person to another like a hot potato without ever fully healing. There are signs that illnesses are also not physical, but spiritual, and has physical manifestations. When such illnesses arise in a family, a mudang is called to facilitate the kut. A ritual is prepared, and the spirit is called forth. And in the old days, the entire village might be called to participate and bear witness. The mudang then will fully open herself up to possession by the spirit, and the grieving spirit, and if it's indeed an ancestral spirit wanting to be heard by the family, will enter her. And if there is grief or han that has to be undone, she will then begin another ritual called the hanpuri, which literally means the release of unspeakable sorrow. What we witness as han in our society, as upheaval, is not random. As we watch violence unfold like mirror images in different cities and towns across this nation, they are symptoms of something else buried underneath. Energy reincarnating and manifesting in ley lines across this land where the soil was drenched with native blood on forced marches, Chinese blood in mines and railroads, and the blood of enslaved black peoples everywhere, from wide open fields to Black Wall Street to Tuskegee and Oscarville. But from whose ancestors do we need the exorcism? And whose ancestors need the healing? Whose energy do we transmute, and whose energy do we incarnate with us into the future? When the mudang dives into the ritual of hanpuri, she imbues herself with great patience. She spends time with the spirit. Usually it's a ghost who's crossed over with things left undone, with regrets, or it's an ancestor who seeks justice. You see, in our tradition, our ancestors in death aren't suddenly released into the great beyond, free from their worries, escaping their pain. Yes, they're free from their bodies, their physical illnesses, but there are some things in life that they've suffered in this world, some traumas and pain so deep, some grief so generationally heavy that they even bury inside your spirit. And when your spirit is finally free from its physical container, the pain and the sorrow it's so long held is also no longer contained. Sometimes that pain and sorrow is unleashed in ways even the spirit is unable to bear alone. Therefore, they still need us in our flesh, and we still need them in their spirit. For with them, they are closer to the primordial ones, the ancestral ones who've never been touched by the tools of empire, who know liberation and freedom in ways that we might have never known. Whether we are life side or spirit side, we're still community. If you're someone in your tradition who practices ancestor veneration or honors your ancestors in some way, communicating with them, retelling their stories of faith, then you understand this. They're still present with us. Their energy not only courses through our veins, but they are involved in our lives and they are invested. Community is boundless forever. And as Christians, we believe in the communion of saints, do we not? Even Christ, once he rose again, didn't immediately and eagerly yeet himself out into the great beyond, but he chose to seek out his earthly companions first. Christ returned to the people he cherished, to those earthly bonds that pulled him back. The mudang's role is to facilitate that pulling back of the ancestral spirit into the bonds of community. Sometimes the ancestor is grieving something they've done to someone during their living years. They want to make amends. But because their spiritual energy is racked with grief, now in spirit form, fully understanding the impact of their human choices, they only know how to reach out by perpetuating more trauma and pain. Sometimes the ancestor is grieving something that happened to them unjustly. In either case, as part of the ceremony, the mudang invites the spirit to inhabit her body while her deities protect her from the negative energies of the spirit. And in time, she interprets the han and the grief of the spirit, and in doing so begins to unravel it. She shares the story of the spirit with those who are gathered, and she does so through many modalities of storytelling, through song, dance, simple storytelling, and even by telling jokes, sometimes vulgar ones. We've all had moments when we've chosen to laugh, and to laugh hard because the other option was to cry. The point is, there's no linear way to tell a story of pain, of histories of suffering and sorrow deliberately silenced or locked away. What the Mudang understands and what the community gathered understands is that you must virtually relive the story with the spirit, moment by moment, as the energy of the ancestor incarnates. As the story unwinds and disentangles itself through the Mudang's coaxing, the spirit goes through their emotions, and the community mirrors the emotions back. There is weeping and pounding of chests and the ground, the beating of drums and the flailing of bodies in both ecstasy and rage. And there's even communal laughter as the spirit and community together remember that life is not only and all pain. There's sharing of food and alcohol and tea. For all embodied sorrow and grief also means the body needs to be fed to metabolize that pain. And the hanpuri can go on for days and even weeks. In my family's history, the hanpuri and kut of my two great aunts in what was then the northern part of the Korean peninsula went on for a year before our family was finally released by the spiritual energy that was holding them. What is remarkable about the ritual is that the ancestral spirit is ultimately asking for something simple, but something we as human beings find difficult to give. They're asking for a factual, representative, multifaceted accounting of history, an uncovering of real and hidden stories, bearing witness to the stories of grief and sorrow that are unbearable and deep, that they cross over with them beyond life, even when their physical bodies release them. Through practices like kut and hanpuri throughout Korean and Korean diasporic histories, Korean shamanism has served as something called a counterforce to oppressive systems. Next slide, please. The Mudang and her rituals functioned as a counter-narrative to mainstream nationalist, neo-Confucianist, and imperial Christian conservatism that occurred during the war and post-ceasefire U.S. military occupation of the peninsula and U.S. propaganda. Propaganda that rewrote organic, native-led Korean liberation movements as problematic and even anti-democratic. All of it done to set up a US-backed puppet military dictatorship. Korean shamanism through the leadership of Mudangs and their use of counter-narrative through communal and public rituals of named national and communal pain, including grief of war, separation, and the ecological grief of obliterated land. For example, did you know that 85% of infrastructure on the peninsula was destroyed? Did you know that the US, through propaganda that it still feeds us today in our history books, portrays itself as a hero of the Korean War on the peninsula? But what it doesn't tell us is that it dropped over 635,000 tons of bombs and 32,557 tons of napalm on Korean land and people, surpassing total explosives used in the Pacific during World War II. The counter-narrative of Mudangs as they held kuts and hanpuri on the DMZ, by the ocean, and in forgotten remote villages were ways in which they reminded the land and the people that their anguish was not forgotten. Therefore, those rituals were not merely spiritual practice, particularly during times of war and ceasefire, but they were sites of cultural resistance against empire. The work of Mudangs and shamanists of naming real histories, real pain that empire desired to rewrite and render invisible is the work of transmuting energies toward justice. They take Han, which on the national stage and collective stage is untenable rage stemming from harm, violence, and injustice. And in their work of truth-telling and story work, they change that Han into energy of healing. The work of Mudangs, if you see it in action, is also not clean. They deal with things like blood and animal carcasses. It's not sterile. It doesn't look pure. Those words for religious practices actually stem from the colonizer, these words called purity, and they relate to religious and divine purity and perfection, making each of us who are not really any of those things strive for things we can't achieve. The work of Korean spirit workers is opposite. It's chaotic, it's messy, it's loud, it's vibrant, and some would call it barbaric. And some who've observed it from Western colonized lenses have called it that. In other words, it's a form of cathartic violence. Next slide, please. This is what Frantz Fanon calls the necessary work of counter-violence. Frantz Fanon is a decolonial philosopher whose scholarship analyzed the social and psychological effects of colonialism, understood as cathartic violence, as central to decolonization and liberation. Fanon was not someone who believed in the effectiveness of peaceful protests alone to create necessary and effective change. Not when the colonizer, at the core of their existence, requires violence and dehumanization for the security of their everyday comforts. Their lifestyle is rooted in acts of explicit and implicit acts of violence. It's only ever the most violent people in authority that demand peaceful assembly and peaceful protest and civility, while they're the ones who get to define what the markers of peace and civility are in every place and time. And what that usually means is their boots on our necks. Therefore, in Fanon's framework, violence in the hands of the dehumanized and oppressed is understood as cleansing and transformative energy work. Fanon sees violence as, quote, freeing the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores self-respect, end quote. Through acts of counter-violence, the colonized can purge themselves of the psychological trauma inflicted by colonization. Counter-violence does not mean performing violence in mimicry of the colonizer. I want you to hear that. Counter-violence does not mean performing violence in mimicry of the colonizer. In fact, Fanon emphasized violence alone cannot bring about liberation. Counter-violence must be understood as part of a broader transformative struggle. Fanon recognizes the limits to violence. He says that acts of violence dehumanizes others and therefore also dehumanizes the self. Fanon and many people who fought in resistance movements found around the world have understood violence as creative and constructive. It is an urging for the colonized to transform the violent energy already forced in their lives and already forced upon them into acts that the colonizer already and always perceive as violence. For instance, think about observation and witnessing. Observation and witnessing is now currently being perceived as violent acts. It is being met with brute force in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and other cities. Part of doing this type of transmutation energy work, which is in a way has always been its own form of magic and folk magic work among indigenous people everywhere, is to understand, to engage the work of transmuting violent energy through counter-violence, creative sustaining energies that construct and reconstruct new histories, new stories, real histories, visibilizing people rendered invisible, destroying hierarchies. All of this is considered violence by the state. For global majority people, their bodies alone, their existence alone is considered a threat and a violence, a violation. This is how we arrive at ethnic cleansing. The more intense the struggle for justice becomes, the more barbarous and savage those of us resisting will appear to the authoritarian. They are calling most of us domestic terrorists now, are they not? Did you know if you don't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, you're a domestic terrorist? Ultimately, those of us who receive protection from the systems and structures of white supremacy, white kinship, from American exceptionalism, from U.S. citizenship and Christian religion must become traitors to those systems and structures in order that some of us might survive. Because as in any revolution, not all of us will survive. Are you willing to live a traitorous life? We follow an incarnated and incarcerated Christ who was a traitor to his government, but not to his people. who shifted and transmuted the energy, God's own divine energy, to confine God's self into a fragile human frame to dwell with us. Are you willing to live a traitorous life? To transmute the energy of raw violence and rage into one that strives to humanize, to name, to call out, to reclaim histories, to tell the real stories, to tell truth, to do justice for this time? Next slide. I want to leave you with this. There are practical ways to transmute the energy. First, in the coming days, months, and years, we have work to do. We each have roles to take on in our communities, in our families, our neighborhoods, and cities at large. But your role might not be the same as the role of those around you. A good rule of thumb to help us understand is this. We are on the same side, but we are not on the same team. We are on the same side, but we are not all on the same team. Remember whose side you're on. Look around and make sure you know who's on your side. Know their names, know their faces, where they live, who they are, so they can't be disappeared so easily, because they will be disappeared. So they can't be invisibilized, so their stories can't be diminished. Remember what team you're on, because each team has a different mission. The mission of your team might not be the mission of my team. For some people's teams, their mission is just to make it, to survive. And because we're all on the same side, it becomes part of other teams' mission to make sure their mission succeeds. Know whose side you're on. Know what team you're on. Know your mission. What's something you and others like you with the power you have can accomplish that others might not be able to achieve with as much ease? Notice I didn't say that's easy for you to do. Okay? With as much ease. It still might be difficult for you, but comparatively, it's easier for your team than another team. Another practical thing is to show and tell stories. Like Fanon's counter-violence, indigenous decolonial educators called story work methodology counter-storytelling. It's a way for storytelling to become how to keep the record and tell and transmit truth. Story work at its core is oral traditioning, memorized and recited, but it can also be written down. But oral traditioning and memorization and recitation are tools of resistance that are becoming more important as digital surveillance becomes ever more prevalent. There is a reason why so many of our ancestors preserved their histories, stories, and traditions in this way. Truth is embodied in the face of state-run media and propaganda, and the way that our private networks are surveilled. We're going to have to relearn how to tell stories accurately. This means we're going to also have to learn to listen well to one another. Slowing down to hear what people are saying and not saying. What is being communicated in the silence? Third, make memories and love each other deeply. I spent 4 years searching for and listening for and then harvesting the stories of my grandparents' lives, now ancestors, for a book coming out later this year. Their stories from Japanese occupation and the Korean War and ceasefire. And one of the learnings that I internalized from sitting with their stories was how they remembered that people lived and loved in the midst of death and dying. They loved one another deeply, not in a way that distracted them from the very real pain of what people, including them, were suffering, but in ways that only people who were faced every day with imminent death could mean and could know how to do. There was never a guarantee of later or tomorrow, so they lived that day and they loved one another in the moments that they had. They shared the kind word when it came to them, instead of holding it back. They helped their neighbor when they could because they knew they would be the one that needed help next. They transmuted the energies of hopelessness and despair into one of love in the face of death. And it reincarnated through their descendants in new generations as memory. My bones remember that I am part of a future my ancestors shaped out of the ashes of a family and a divided nation. For some of you, you know who you are. As you look around at the burning world, remember, you are the future that your ancestors claimed instead of despair. The one they bear witness to now, peering at you with joy through the porous boundaries of life and death. Last slide, please. You are living proof that there are indeed just futures waiting for us beyond unjust and violent times, if we might rise to claim them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hong, for such a powerful talk this morning. I know there is so much to think about. There is so much to grapple. There is so much wisdom in what you shared this morning. Thank you. Friends, I know you have so many thoughts going on in your minds. I know you have so many words that you want to express. But before you do so, before you have your questions shared with the rest of the group, I would ask us to take a few minutes, like a 10-minute break. You know, even as you take a break, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, because this is such a powerful and deep topic and theme. And we'll reconvene in 10 minutes here, and then we will take question and answers. check. Friends, it's almost time. Let us all gather back. Friends, we're about to start the question and answer session. If you don't mind getting to your seats and taking your seats, I'll request Dr. Christine Hong to come up on the stage. Friends, there are two microphones that are on either sides here. If you have a question, I would request you to come forward to the microphone and introduce yourselves and then ask the question. And by any chance, if you cannot come to the microphones, you just raise your hand. I'll come with the microphone and then I'll give it to you, or one of our colleagues can do that for you. So with that being said, I'll open this up for question and answers.
You'll tell me when it's time.
Yes.
Okay.
Are we ready?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. You mentioned energy throughout your talk, and I'm just wondering if you've drawn any correlations with quantum entanglement.
I have no idea what that is.
Oh, well, basically where there's, all energy is connected.
Oh, yes, okay.
You turn something here and something in Korea is affected, right? It's so this channeling of energy that can do destructive things or to do healing. Maybe you could expand a little bit on how you, if we're all connected and energy's all connected, how does energy get transmuted? And you alluded to story, the role of story to not shame but to heal, remembering our history. Maybe you could expand a little bit on how that happens, because it seems to be there in our current administration there's a fear of telling the truth about our history as a country.
I think there will always be, like, not only in this country but around the world. I think part of what we have to focus on as we live here in this country is to widen our lens to see what's happening in other places around the world. That's part of the truth-telling that we have to do, is kind of take off our American exceptionalist lens, right? So knowing that we actually aren't the center of the world, although it feels that way a lot of times, to see how our stories are connected to the stories of other people and how their stories are connected to ours. And their stories are sometimes central to what's happening to us here. So those are some of the truth tellings sometimes that we have to do to tell. Those are sometimes the stories that get hidden, that don't want to be told in our midst. That's some of the biggest propaganda, I think, sometimes that we teach ourselves and to one another and tell each other, even those of us who are more, quote unquote, progressive in this country, telling ourselves that we are more important or we are the center of the world. Even the way that we look at the map, like if you look at, right, public school classrooms, a lot of times like the maps that are on the wall will portray quite literally the Americas, or even the United States of America, is physically larger, even though that's really not what it looks like if you look at an actual map. So I would say zoom out more. It's not even just about like our stories are connected or being afraid to tell the truth, or how are we less scared to tell the truth. Seeing our stories as just one in the larger scope of global stories and histories? How are we connected, truly connected, and not at the center is going to be the hardest thing for us in this day and age. So even though we are moving into things like authoritarianism and fascism now, so are many other places and nations around the world. Japan is one place that is entrenching itself in authoritarianism right now, having elected a very, very conservative prime minister, if you've been following that. So things like this affect us in deep ways, just as we affect them, are worth following, worth knowing about. So those are ways in which we reveal truths to ourselves and also see why there are truths hidden from us. I think also learning your own, relearning histories, even especially histories of militarism around the world and the way in which the US military has occupied different lands in ways that we never knew about is really important. Like me as a Korean person in diaspora, learned about the Korean War through the US public school system. And it is not how my family experienced it. So imagine as a kid growing up in the US public school system, how jarring it was for me to learn that like the United States was this big hero on the peninsula. And I'd have Korean War veterans coming up to me all the time being like, hey, I fought in your war, haha. And I'd be like, what? What are you talking about? You dropped napalm on our people. So it's things like that, right? Like these jarring experiences of people know completely different stories than I grew up knowing. And there are so many studies about how people are formed and malformed because of these things. So learning each other's histories, uncovering the untruths, therefore telling the real truths to our children, things like that. I mean, even telling the true story of Thanksgiving, things like this that seem easy, but are actually very difficult to do, are the everyday things.
Incredible talk, and thank you, and I feel very energized by what you've been saying. So my question, so I was very interested by this, by the colonial boomerang, which, you know, as I was sitting there thinking about it, I was like, well, is this authoritarian reboot the little boomerang, and is AI the big boomerang, i.e., you know, our ever quest for, you know, more and more and more wealth, and that is the driver of AI. And, you know, it's interesting in yesterday on one of our local NPR programs, Chris Boyd Think, there was really quite a doomsday discussion about what, you know, AI, if it passes several more hurdles, could mean for, you know, for even human survival, never mind potentially human enslavement, which would be the better of the two scenarios. And then, you know, there was a piece in the New York Times this morning about, you know, the critique of the billionaire class over the Pope's remarks on AI and needing to keep AI within the service of humanity and not cross these barriers. And, you know, the billionaire class was saying, well, you know, the Peter Thiels and stuff are like, oh, you're just an old fuddy-duddy, you know, you don't really know where this needs to go, et cetera. So what are your thoughts about AI as potentially the big boomerang that could completely, you know, either end our civilization or make us permanently enslaved to the machine class?
I think AI is one of the things that we are now realizing, some of us too late, is that we are in a water bankruptcy era. Right? So, and there are communities among us in this country that have known that for far longer than some of us. So Native communities, poor communities, rural communities have known this for a lot longer. There are communities still among us with no clean water. And now there are communities with no water at all. I mean, I live in Decatur, and there are communities near us with data centers being built that are, even with smaller data centers, are lacking water. And now there's like larger data centers being built around them, so we don't even know what's going to happen to those towns on the fringes there. So one of the things that we have to recognize is that there are ripple effects to the choices that we make. And we can only turn away from those ripple effects for so long. For so long. And that is just what it is. So we have to come face to face with the choices that we make when we use AI, and it is almost impossible to not use it anymore. Every time you go through security at the airport, every time that you are using Google Maps or Waze, or are using Uber or Lyft to track, where you're going, every time you put something in a search engine, it is almost impossible not to use a form of AI anymore. One of my colleagues, who is now retired, Dr. Marcia Riggs, who is a womanist ethicist, has always shared something very tangible with me that's been helpful. And she says that there is almost no way to extract yourself from complicity in a lot of these systems and structures, because they're bound up so much in the ways that we live, and we're forced to live in this world. But what you can do is begin to calculate and look at the ways in which you can mitigate those complicities. So instead of just throwing your hands up and saying, well, I can't do anything about it, I guess. And then, ChatGPT, show me what I look like, Instead of just giving up, really calculate the ways in which you can also mitigate those complicities. Can you donate to organizations that are fighting back? Can you give back and give your time and energy to people and places that are pushing back, that are doing conservation, that are looking for new ways to conserve water, to save communities, to look beyond data centers? Because it's almost impossible to not use these things. And that's intentional. But it also means that it doesn't mean carte blanche, right? It doesn't mean that we can just also say, well, it doesn't matter anymore, I guess, so I'm just gonna do whatever. But to live in that wisdom, to know that every time we do something, there is an impact to someone else, and that even if it's not a person, it should matter. That's the other thing I think that is a very decolonial and anti-colonial perception and posture we should have as human beings, is that just because the impact is not towards another human being, that it's a more than a human being or to the planet, it should still matter to us just as deeply. Because we're connected. We're all connected. So, even talking about energies that are connected, I learned recently, if the right whale, it goes extinct, we would all go extinct. So even whales that you've never seen, right out in the ocean, that only do a particular migration trail, we are all so deeply connected. So yes, I think Dr. Riggs, her understanding of mitigating one's complicity, looking for ways. The deeper you are entrenched, the more you should look for ways in which you should mitigate those things.
Any other questions?
I'm Donna Oberkreisser. I'm the pastor at Central Christian in Clearwater, Florida, and I'm also an alum of Brite Divinity. Thank you for what you had to say and share with us today. I'm curious, it kind of has to do with a lot of what you've been talking about, but what I've been reading about are how younger entrepreneurs are now creating organizations that rather than, and I mean businesses, rather than saying, which was maybe an older generation's model, once my business makes enough money, I will give back in whatever way to mitigate whatever thing. the mentality now is, why can't I do that as my business grows, as my business becomes bigger, more important, makes more money? Why can't I mitigate as I go? I'm just wondering if you might comment on that and how we might convince more people to see it that way.
Yeah, so this is a little bit different, but I was given really great advice by a senior scholar one time, it was Dr. Kwok Wheelan, and she was saying something about taking risks as a junior scholar. And she said, if you're going to wait until you have all the power and prestige to take the risks you're going to take and to advocate for the people you plan to advocate for because you're safer then, you're just never going to do it. Like, that's just you saying you're never going to do it. Because there's never going to be a time when you're actually fully safe, and never going to be a time when it's just right. That's really, I think that extends to all categories. I think about like the widow's mite, even that story. No matter how small of a thing we have, every little bit counts. And I think about my own grandparents when I was harvesting the stories that they had from the war. They were refugees on this island called Koje Island, which is a tiny, tiny fishing agricultural island off the coast of Busan, Korea. And the US military eventually sent like 1 million people to this island that originally only had 100,000 people. So the island's ecosystem just basically died because the US government didn't care. They were just dumping people on this island. And so there was nothing growing. The it was just fished out. There were no oysters, nothing. And so everybody on that island was starving, but didn't starve. Nobody died. Nobody died. And it's because everybody just went without together. Nobody hid food from each other. Nobody left anyone to die. They just all got thinner and smaller, but together. My grandparents, who brought with them my grandparents' sister-in-law and 5 children, ended up staying for 1 year with an elderly woman, her 2 daughters, and their 3 children in a 1-room home. And this woman opened her home to them, and they all lived together in this tiny 1-room home. And old Korean homes have this place called a madang, which is sort of like an open-air courtyard. And they would take turns sleeping out in this open-air courtyard under the indigenous pine trees and the stars. And she said, you can stay here as long as you have need. And they converted actually through her and her church on that tiny island. But it was because of the tenacity of these island people, these 100,000 folks who didn't let those other 900,000 folks die. They all starved, but no one died. And I think about that, right? What does community really mean? Is it waiting till till I'm full to give you something? Or does it mean that we all live and survive?
Hello, thank you for your speech. Thank you also for the welcome. My name is Marie Maynard O'Connell. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and I'm also in a chaplaincy program in Arkansas. And I'm also the pastor of a new community through the Presbyterian Church of Queer Collective. And so I was hearing a lot of this with different ears. And I wondered if you would speak a little bit more to the idea of counter-violence. Because you rightly noted that observation and witnessing and existence is being perceived as violence. And I just wanted to know if you could speak more about that, because I think that is a very real topic in some of our communities.
Yes, so I think that as authoritarianism grows everyday existence for more and more people will begin to be perceived as acts of violence. However, for some of us, that has always been the case. So for those whom it has always been the case will be even more at risk exponentially. So the risk only continues to rise. So there's never going to be like equity in risk, right? So like, let's say for queer folks, it's always been a risk. For trans people, let's say, it's always been a risk to exist. And for some people, even like the existence of trans people has been perceived as like a violent thing. Like I just feel it incites violence, right? So violence begets violence. It incites violence in them to do acts of violence. So that, if observing is being perceived as violence, then that trans person is, they're gonna experience even more heightened violence in those times. And that's why like what I said about sides and teams is even more important, to understand sort of what your mission is. So for that trans person and the communities that surround them, it becomes even more important that they survive. And that becomes the main mission. And their communities do everything they can to make sure that that heightened risk means that they are even more protected and that they can survive and make it. So it's knowing that the risk will never be equitable. And that's like part of the mythology of like, we're all in the revolution together. Sometimes the mythology makes it seem like at some point the risk is shared equitably, but it's never gonna be that way. So when people are saying like, I can't be on the front lines because of this or that, or because my very existence is seen as being a violation to this state, believe them. Believe them. And get in the front. I had a student ask me recently, like, what's it gonna take? And this student was in a white body, right? So what's it gonna take? And I said, it's gonna take everything that you have. And you have to know in this moment what you are gonna be willing to give up. No hyperbole. And it's a long game right now. Also knowing that as the counter violence is also not about like, think about rage. Rage, when it comes up, burns hot and fast and then it dies, right? Sometimes like that's not helpful. Because when you are exhausted from your rage, what do? You just like disappear. But we need to be able to sometimes have anger that burns long. So in Korean, we call this han, right? This like kind of long, seething rage that's like generational. And we always want to like soothe it and kind of bury it. But sometimes I feel like it's an asset to the Korean people. Because it is like a reminder of like, this is what injustice looks like. We know what it looks like, right? We know what justice should feel like, what it sounds like. It's a reminder. So sometimes like that rage needs to not burn so hot, and it needs to like seethe so that we can remember and we can like gain that energy and not tire so fast. Because people need you to not tire out so fast. Right? So I hope that kind of helps. So counter-violence is strategic. It's strategic. It's not random chaos. Because regular state violence is strategic.
Friends, we have time for 2 more questions.
I appreciate your thoughts and speech this morning. It's wonderful. We appreciate it so much. I have concerns for the Palestinian situation right now and those in Iran. It seems like all this is bubbling up all over. Yeah. And I continue to have those concerns. And then on a secondary and most personal note, I'm going to spend a week with my granddaughter on a trip for her senior year this summer. What does a grandfather share with his granddaughter to share the story, the history that she needs to hear?
And it's like the most beautiful question. I also share your concerns about Palestine, and I share your concerns about the people of Iran. I think you tell her about those concerns and how you came to them, and why that's important to you, and why you hope that you would hear that those are important to you as you sit in this place in this country. After everything that you have experienced in your life, why that sits on your heart. Why that is not a tangent to what is happening here. I think too many people can't make those connections. The violence, the state violence that happens here and the state violence that's happening in Gaza and in Iran and other places in this world, that those connections can't be made. Or they're unwilling to make those connections. And I think if you can make those connections, it's a gift. And having those conversations can help her have them with others. Because believe it or not, I think that what we saw with the encampments on college campuses, those are conversations that younger people are having a hard time having with each other, clearly. And creating space to have those conversations with you is a gift.
Mike from LA, back to the mic here. We've just kind of picks up on the family love with the question of filial piety. I lived in Taiwan for a year, and I was moved by ancestor worship and the rituals associated with this. And now more recently, wondering with, the physicists talking about 34 different dimensions and the mediums talking about communicating with the dead, and new books coming out, New York bestsellers on the signs that we can look for loved ones communicating with us. Could you speak a little bit more about this communication that takes place, especially with the Korean rituals? Thank you.
Yeah, so it looks different, I think, for different indigenous traditions of communicating with the dead or with spirits. And Korean indigenous tradition believes that everything has a spirit. So there are land spirits, tree spirits, rock spirits, ocean spirits. Everything has a spirit, and those spirits are not beneath human spirits. So you can actually see this in a lot of East Asian worldview. Like if you look at East Asian art, you can see how different it is from European art because we don't really have portraiture. So you know how European art, there's like portraiture, like people sitting with their families in front of couches, or like, just East Asian art doesn't have that until it encounters the West. A lot of East Asian art, it's a lot of ecology. Like, so you'll see a landscape, and then here in the corner you'll see a little man on a boat. And it's because the worldview of the land, the sea, the sky, the sun, and people is that we are just together. And everything revolves around the other, and it's connected in a very deep way. And so people are just part of that energy. And so ancestral worship or ancestral veneration, it's not really worship, is what I would say. It is mutual veneration. So I'm going to describe it to you. So what happens at the ancestral altar is, the altar is like a portal. The altar is like a portal. So when you go to venerate your ancestors, let's say you bring, what I usually bring is a bowl of water as my daily practice, because the water symbolizes your body. It just symbolizes, because we're made of water. It just seems Makes sense, right? The water symbolizes your body. If I'm doing something special, I might bring something my ancestors liked in real life. Like my grandma and my grandpa really liked Korean mixed coffee. So I'll bring that. Or maybe a piece of fruit, but nothing that you've already eaten, right? Something new. So I'll bring that, and my altar has their picture in the middle. I also have a cross that my daughter made when she was 5. It's very pink and bedazzled. And it sits between me and them. It has a rock from Jeju Island, the year that they were refugees there. It has other shells because we're both Korean people or ocean people, so we like things from the ocean. It has other things on there. And what happens is when we bring our offering, we are also bringing our petition. So we bring the things that we ask, please help us and guide us in this day. But it's interesting, they're not God, okay? They're not God. And my ancestors were Christian. So I just say, hey, when you are there with Jesus, I need a little extra, and I'll share my concerns. It's like talking to anybody that you love. And I really feel their presence there. They're on the other side, and there's a table on their side too, and they bring things too. They see the things that I've put on that altar, and they put things there too. Maybe it's extra sleep I need, and they'll put that there. Maybe it's more energy, and they put that there. So if I put like an apple there, they'll put all those things there. And we make our vows mutually at the altar. It's mutual veneration. And then after I'm done talking to them, they may ask a few things, hey, how come you got mad at your kid the other day? That wasn't cool, right? How come you're not sleeping so much? You really should get some more rest. It's really interesting. Ancestors aren't God. So they're not concerned about you didn't pray 5 times, They're not concerned about those things. They're concerned about your daily, are you all right? Did you eat? You drinking enough water? Are you happy? They're worried about your well-being. They're worried. They're your family. What are you learning lately? They're also learning. They're watching your life and they're learning through you because you do things differently than they would have and that they did. And they're like, oh, you did that differently than I would have. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, what is that? Okay. And then their energy cycles back to us when they learn things, right? And then when we learn things, it cycles back to us and changes the way that they would respond to us. It's a cyclical pattern. They're not perfect because they're not God. We're not perfect because we're not God. So we're learning. It's mutual veneration, mutual learning through the portal. And so they put their blessings. We put our petition. They put their blessings in the things on the table. And then I might take the apple away later and have it for lunch. And then the blessing they put in the apple goes through me as an embodied expression of their love. And that's how we see it in our tradition. There's the spiritual communication, and then there's the physical manifestation. And that actually is true for a lot of other religious traditions too, with the elements on the table. But it's not worship, it's veneration, it's honoring. And it's the extension of the human relationship. Who your ancestor was to you in life is who they will be beyond. And if your ancestor didn't know you or you don't know them, they know you. They know you. You don't have to know them or you don't have to be able to know their name or have met them or know them for them to know you. They know you. They know you, and you can call on them.
So friends, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Christine Hong for being here and for sharing her wisdom with us this morning. One of the things that I really liked about this talk is the incredible way in which Dr. Hong has brought together different strands of thought together. And for the reminder, to know who is on our team, and to continue the story work methodology, and also to make memories and to love deeply. So friends, join me in giving Dr. Hong one more round of applause, please. So just to remind you, her memoir is coming out this year, so watch out for it. One announcement that I would make before we conclude this session is that lunch will be served at 11:30 upstairs. If you have signed up for it, you'll have a box lunch upstairs, so please pick it up. And I've been reminded that in the schedule that you've been given, there is an error. For tomorrow's afternoon program, the workshops are going to start at 1:30, not at 3:15 as it mentions in the schedule. So don't plan according to what you have. Change it to 1:30. So with that, thank you so much for being here, everybody, and let us continue to have a wonderful time.